Good morning. First off, I want to thank Bobby and his family for coming all the way from Japan to hear me preach today. I didn't know I was that important to you, but you didn't have any other reason, did you? But, yeah, okay. We're going to be speaking for 3 weeks out of the book of 1 Corinthians. And what we're going to specifically be looking at is problems in the Corinthian church. Now, one of the things that if you go back and look, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, Robert preached on 1 Corinthians 1. And Robert called Corinth the Vegas of its time, okay, the Las Vegas of its time. Probably at least that bad. If you're familiar with ancient history, I'd probably compare it to the Pompeii of its time. Corinth was definitely a city that had all kinds of immorality. It was known for that. It had temple prostitution. It had all kinds of stuff going on. So what happened was this church forms in the midst of Corinth, and this church is not necessarily taking on a new path. Instead, the church is acting pretty much like the people around it. And because of that, Paul had to send a letter, and Paul had to say, I am ticked. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into the book of 1 Corinthians. We're going to be looking today at chapter 5. One of these crossed my mind about a week ago. I was sitting in a restaurant, and there was a lovely little 4-year-old child or so. I'm sure nothing like your child. About a 4-year-old child that thought that he would serenade the entire restaurant with his screams and shrieks and everything else. And then it would get quiet for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, 20 seconds, and all of a sudden you'd hear another shriek and you'd kind of shiver. Now what got me wasn't so much that the kid was doing this, because it was a 4-year-old kid who obviously had never been trained. The real issue here is the reflection on the parents. The parents sat there the entire time and either ignored the kid who was screaming, or they sat there and thought, oh, isn't that funny? No, you're morons. It wasn't funny, trust me. But the point is that they thought this was just wonderful that the kid would scream and shriek in a nice restaurant. Well, the truth is, again, the reflection is more on the parents than it is on the child. Now, the reason I bring that up is because in 1 Corinthians, it's very easy in 1 Corinthians 5 to get hung up on this guy who's sleeping with his stepmother and start focusing on his sin. But if we look at this chapter really isn't about the individual and his sin as much it is about the church's response to that sin. In fact, 1 Corinthians 5 is what I would call the primary passage in the New Testament on church discipline. Now, many people think of Matthew chapter 18 as the primary passage, thinking about, you go to your brother one-on-one. If that doesn't work, you go two-on-one. If that doesn't work, you take the elders. If that doesn't work, etc. I think that's good advice, but the reason I say that's not the primary passage to the church is because when Matthew 18 was written, the church didn't exist. That was actually speaking to the Jewish congregation, the Jewish synagogues, and it couldn't be information to the church since the church didn't exist. Good advice. I think it's good that we follow that advice. But when we look at actual church discipline passages in the New Testament, this is the primary one that we see. Now, we want to take a look and start with 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1. And it says, it is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and immorality of such a kind that it does not even exist among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. First thing we want to look at is this is a rather extreme example. And one of the problems we have when we look at churches today is that churches, when it comes to church discipline, tend to take one of two approaches. Either the one approach is extreme, you're going to discipline everything, or we're going to let everything go. One of the things I'll never forget, I grew up in this area, for those you don't know. I actually lived my entire life in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. And my brother and I both went to high school at Riverdale Baptist Penitentiary, school. I was paroled in 1978, he was paroled in 1982. Anyway, at Riverdale there was a situation after I had left, but when he was there, when he was in high school, where Riverdale for a number of years had promised the students they could have a student newspaper. Well, they kept asking it and never, oh yeah, you can have it. But then they never allowed them to do it. Well, if you haven't met my brother before, and you haven't met the rest of my family, I one in the family, okay? My brother you'd never forget him if you met him. Nice guy, but you'd never forget him. And what happened was him and 3 of his friends decided they were going to publish their own school newspaper without the school knowing about it. And they did. And it was childish and it was juvenile. It was offensive, sure. But it wasn't the end of the world offensive or something like that. But they made the mistake of criticizing the administration of the school. As far as they were concerned, this was the end. My brother was actually labeled as an agent of Satan by the school administrator for putting this thing out. And in addition to that, 2 of the kids that were involved in this were members of the National Christian Honor Society. Now at Riverdale, the tradition was, at least when you were put into the Christian Honor Society, there's a ceremony where you go up front and they light your candle. Okay? Riverdale decided that the only way to handle this in the school was to have a special ceremony for just those 2 students, to come forward with their lit candles and have them extinguished in front of everyone at the school. It ended up with some physical threats from some of the parents against the administrators. Fortunately, my brother was not in the Honor Society to start with. He should have been, but probably made a few too many enemies with the administration. But the point was, it didn't apply to him, but these other 2, to be honest with you, I would not have allowed my child to go down that aisle and extinguish a candle in front of everyone. To me, this is just absolute extremism with discipline. You know, spit on the sidewalk, church discipline. You know, look the wrong way at the pastor, church discipline, whatever. I'm not talking about our church, by the way. But you're going to see these extreme examples around. On the other end of the spectrum, we've always got these classic tales of the Catholic churches up in New York City and places like that who had the mafia dons who would come to church there. But they gave so much money. No church discipline at all in those cases. And I'm not condemning all Catholic churches here either. That's just the example that I came up with. But there has to be something in the middle where we start to recognize this is appropriate church discipline, this is inappropriate church discipline. Now, if we look at this verse specifically, one of the things that we're going to see, I'm looking at the New American Standard Version, and it says that there is immorality among you, and immorality of such a kind that it doesn't exist among the Gentiles. The actual word for immorality here is porneia. And you've probably heard that word. I know I've heard Pastor use that word before here from the pulpit. And that word is the same word that we get our word pornography from. But forgetting about our modern meanings, back when you go back in context, what it was immorality, but it was specifically sexual immorality. Could refer to incest, could refer to prostitution, could refer to fornication, could refer to homosexuality, any number of things, but it was specifically a sexual immorality. Okay? Now, if we look down in this verse to see what the actual sin was, which we need to understand, it says that someone has his father's wife, someone sleeping with his father's wife. The first question we've got is, why does it say father's wife, not his mother? The reason is because most likely this was his stepmother. Okay? Now, from my perspective personally, that takes it from about a 10 to a 9.9 on the yuck scale. I don't care if it's mother or stepmother. Either, I mean, I feel like I'm in the middle of a Jeff Foxworthy joke here where it's like, you might be a Corinthian if. This is something that is just so grotesque that even the Corinthians were grossed out about it. And if you think about it, that's quite a statement coming from an immoral society like that, saying the Corinthians are grossed out by what you're doing. And this was the testimony of the church. I mean, think about this. What if we had a church filled with people with incest and pedophiles and everything else, and we knew about it, it was public, and we did nothing about it, and as a church, we're going out into our community and we're saying, wouldn't you like to know about the love of Jesus? What do you think the response would be? The response would be awful, and it should be awful. And that's what Paul's saying here is, guys, in Corinth, you got a problem. It is so grotesque that even the Corinthians are offended by this. That takes some work. So, what was the Corinthians' response to this? If we look at verse 2, and you have become arrogant, and have not mourned instead, in order that the one who has done this deed might be removed from your midst. We got a guy sleeping with a stepmother, but that's okay because we're so wonderful and so spiritual. That was the Corinthians' response. They became proud, they became puffed up, they became arrogant. There was a complete loss of shame. Probably about a month ago, something happened that is still sticking in my memory. I was driving, if you know where I live, out in Fairwood, Church Road is not too far from us. And there's one spot on Church Road where it goes from 2 lanes each direction to 1 lane each direction. And there's like literally a 90-degree corner you go around there. Not bad if you take it at 15 miles per hour like you're supposed to take it. I was coming up on the 2 lane each way side, going toward the 1 lane each way side. Some lovely woman who was driving a minivan was coming on the other direction. And when she got to this corner, she was not only going too fast, she cut it too sharp, and I realized, she's in my lane heading at me. And then I realized, she's on my shoulder, even beyond my lane heading at me. So I did hit the horn, and I hit the brakes, and I managed to avoid her, and she swerved back across my lane. At that point in time, she slammed on her horn and started honking at me. And then, since it was a nice day, the windows were open, and she said a few things to me. She screamed out that I'm pretty sure didn't say, "Have a nice day." And she followed up with a couple of customary gestures. The fact is, this woman should have been so upset by what she did, she should have been ashamed of driving head-on into someone else's lane. Instead of being ashamed of driving into somebody else's lane, she was puffed up, proud, and arrogant, and had decided she's the one in the right, so she's going to honk, she's going to curse, and she's going to use the gestures. Same situation with the Corinthians. Put it in modern terms, and all of a sudden it starts to make sense. They're getting puffed up, and they're trying to call themselves spiritual, yet look at what's going on in their midst. If we look at this word for mourn, something that's interesting here, the word in the original language for mourn doesn't mean, "oh, sorry," or something like that. The word for mourn actually is a word that, one definition is passionate grief that leads to action. Examples, when someone is so sorry they burst into tears. Example, same word would have been used for mourning for the dead at that point in time. If you go back into the Septuagint, I believe it was the same word that was used for things like when the cities were going to be judged and they didn't want to be judged, so they put on sackcloth and ashes and mourned and walked around with, blackened faces and horrible clothing and everything just to prove how repentant they were. That's the word for mourn right here. So what Paul's saying is, you guys shouldn't be puffed up. Forget about being pride. You should be down on your knees, crying about this, the fact that you've allowed this to go on. And not simply that you're talking about how terrible that guy is, but the problem is how terrible they were for allowing it. It's not the way things should be. Now, if you look, I've done a neat little, 6 points, all beginning with 1 letter and everything, with the problem, the pride, the prescription, the poison, etc. You can tell I took a homiletics class years ago. Now we get to the prescription. What is to be done about this? And the first thing we see is in verse 3, it says, "For I, on my part, though absent in body and present in spirit, have already judged him who has so committed this, as though I were present." Basically, Paul's saying, I don't need to be anywhere near this. I don't care what the reasons are. I don't care what the excuses are. If you're sleeping with your mother or your stepmother, it's wrong. Don't need to know anything more about this. And not only that, we're not talking about a situation where it was like an incest victim here, a child being forced into it. This was a person who was willingly sleeping with his mother and carrying on. Now, one of the things that comes to mind is, in my business, I have a network engineering company. And years ago, I still have one client here who's a construction company, basically. And I have come in whenever they get in big problems and help them with their network. First time I ever met them, I went to one of their sites where they take trailers and haul them around to the construction sites. And the site was the Alexandria Sewage Treatment Facility. I want to assure you of something here. I didn't need to get inside that facility to judge what was going on. 3 blocks away, you knew you were getting to the sewage treatment facility. You get to the trailer. Man, you better have something else to put in your nose to stop the stench. Same thing here. Paul didn't have to come over to Corinth to see what was going on. If you're sleeping with your stepmother, it's wrong, period. No need to go in and look at what's going on or anything else. Now, what did Paul say to do? Let's look at verses 4 and 5. "In the name of our Lord Jesus, when you were assembled, and I with you in spirit, with the power of our Lord Jesus, I have decided to deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. So two things are happening here. The first thing is that Paul is saying, for his sake, get rid of him. Because if you just make him feel comfortable about being in your church, he's going to be puffed up himself. He's not going to see any problem with what he's doing. He's going to keep up. He's going to keep doing the same thing. On the other hand, if you put him out of the church, yeah, it's going to be painful. But maybe he'll repent. Maybe he will fall so deeply into sin. Sometimes you got to hit bottom before you turn around. And that's really what Paul's saying here. But that's only half the story. The other thing is, it's to protect the reputation of the church and the church doing the right thing. And remember, that's what this chapter is really about, is the actions of the church. And if you look here, one of the things that brings to mind is, every day people are panicking about Ebola. I'm actually working with my brother-in-law right now for scheduling a missions trip for him to go from Vancouver to Kenya to Spain and back to Vancouver. And let me tell you something. For a month now, we've been going back and forth on, okay, what flights might you want to stay away from depending on which way Ebola goes and things like that. Now, we didn't expect to have to put Dallas on the list. But the point is, we were looking at Spain, we were looking at Kenya, everything else. What was the solution? The solution would be to quarantine for the good of those around. One thing that's interesting, most people haven't heard about, it was about a month ago, either in, I think it was Democratic Republic of Congo or Congo, one of those, actually, maybe, no, I don't think it was Central African Republic. One of the countries right in there between Kenya and West Africa came down with a bad case, with 2 cases of Marburg hemorrhagic fever. For people that are unfamiliar with that, it's actually worse than Ebola, and it's been known longer than Ebola, known since the 1960s. Ebola is in that family of hemorrhagic fever. But we're talking about a disease that makes Ebola, it's got a higher death rate than Ebola. It's as contagious or more contagious than Ebola. 2 cases broke out, and you know what happened? Nothing. Haven't heard any more about it. You know why? Because it was a better medical system in that country who took those 2 people, quarantined them. I never did hear if they died or lived. But the point is, it never spread. The reason it didn't spread is because it was quarantined. When Paul's talking to the church in Corinth, what he's saying is, if you allow this to be in your church, you will destroy your church and destroy your church's reputation. We can't have that as believers. We have been set apart in God's eyes. We have been set apart for something special. Now we have to act like what we already are. We have to live holy lives. They didn't get it. They just didn't see it at all. I don't know if you know this or not, but when you actually start talking up here, after a while you kind of could use something to drink. Pastor Paul probably knows this. Your throat starts to get dry and everything, so I hope you don't mind, but I actually brought something for myself. Hang on a second. Enough of this bottled water type stuff. I drink all around the house. Linda knows this. I drink soda water, seltzer water all the time. And it is great. It's like uncarbonated soft drinks. And not only that, I got it in the cooler with all the ice in it, so it's nice and cold. Hang on a second. You know something? I think what I'm going to do, yeah, that's it. Linda bought me a beautiful glass a few years ago. It's a crystal glass. I frequently drink seltzer water out of it. I don't want it to break. Let me see here. And what you're going to notice, it's really neat. It actually has a thumb hole molded right into it, so that you can actually hold the glass properly. It's actually intended for wine, but we won't say anything about that here. The point is that you can actually hold it, it's comfortable, and the nice thing, believe it or not, it actually tastes different when you drink seltzer water out of crystal as opposed to glass, and certainly out of plastic. Like I said, it's just, I deserve a break up here, don't I? Let me see. Pretty good. Oh, wait, I forgot the poison. Hang on. Okay, hang on a second. I knew it didn't have that tang that it usually has. Hang on a second. I got a silver spoon to stir it with. Hang on. Here it is. Okay. Let me just put the poison in. That's about enough. Okay, stir it in there. Oh, that looks good. Yeah, that'll be better. Yeah, it's good. It's got kind of a zing to it that it didn't have beforehand. Okay, just really, it's fiber, don't worry. But think about this. Actually, I think I will keep drinking this now that I'm at it. Think about this. How much poison did it take to spoil that glass when you thought it was poison? Didn't take a lot, does it? Few of you have been over to my house before and had my candied pork loin that I prepared. Or last Thanksgiving, we had some people over from the church and had a beautiful turkey. With the pork loin, for example, I got a 5-pound pork loin, I got a pound of brown sugar, I get some honey, I get some vanilla, some secret ingredients, etc. Prepare the whole, what have I said to you? Oh yeah, and I get is 3 ounces of strychnine. And if you look at it, 5-pound roast, who's going to notice 3 ounces of strychnine? What's the big deal? Okay? The point is, it doesn't take a lot of poison to kill. Now the reason I'm bringing this up is because if we start looking at the next verses, we're going to see why I brought this up. In 1 Corinthians 5, 6 through 8, it says, your boasting is not good. Oh, that's an understatement. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, just as you are, in fact, unleavened, for Christ, our Passover, also has been sanctified. I'll read verse 8 in a minute. All right. I had to learn a little bit about leaven myself, and I actually asked Linda a couple of years ago about this. If I'm wrong, please correct me in front of everybody. That's fine. Anyway, I'm going from memory here, okay? No, I mean it. She's like a fount of knowledge that I can go to at home, which is wonderful. When you have leaven and when you cook with it, evidently you put the leaven, which is actually yeast, into the dough, and it rises and everything else. Now, my understanding is, from your Mennonite relatives, I think you were telling me, didn't they, and make sure I have this right, didn't they take and grow the yeast and then you put some away and it keeps growing and you keep adding stuff to it and you make more bread and more bread and more bread and it just keeps going because it keeps growing and growing and growing. And you don't need to keep adding leaven or yeast to it every time you bake bread. This lump, which is the lump for the leaven, you use it over and over and over and it keeps going on and on and on. It keeps growing. The only way to stop this bread from growing is get rid of the lump. And if you keep that lump and keep adding to that lump, you're just going to have it keep reproducing. Well, what we can see in the Bible is all the time, or frequently, leaven is used as a symbol for sin. And what Paul's saying here is, guys, get rid of this or it's just going to keep multiplying. It's going to destroy you from within. This isn't something where we can just let it go. This is a grotesque sin that has to be dealt with. And what he's saying is, guys, you need to get rid of the leaven. And by getting rid of the leaven, you're going to fix it. Now think about it again. Only a little bit of leaven destroys. How much of the poison does it take to destroy? You don't have to have a whole bottle of poison or something like that. Same with the leaven. You don't have to have a giant, you don't need a leaven chunk like this. You ever buy a yeast packet? They go in little packets like this. You pour it in. And it just keeps growing and growing and growing. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is, Paul actually, the first thing we've seen also is, Paul is upset and brings up boasting again, tying it back into verse 2. But the other thing I want to get into here is, Paul says, clean out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. We are new lumps. Some of us may be a little lumpier than others. But the fact is, I'm kind of misapplying that here deliberately, and I'll tell you why. The new lump isn't simply referring to the individuals, it's referring to the church at Corinth, which is purified. One of the reasons I say this is because the verbs in this verse are actually plural. And if you look at this verse, what it's saying is, to purify your church, you need to get rid of this guy and put him out. And again, think about it from a practical standpoint. Man, you go out to the Corinthians doing stuff that is worse than they do, that they consider grotesque, and you want to tell them about Christ, they're going to laugh like crazy in your face. They're not going to listen to you, just from a practical standpoint. One of the things I found interesting as far as getting rid of the lumps, I don't want to belabor this point, but a couple of times in the past I've mentioned a church that I went to where it turned out that I found out that the pastor in the church, every single degree he claimed to have was fraudulent. The end result, he ended up actually being convicted of criminal fraud in Prince George's County courts. It was a mess of a situation. And in the end, not only had he lied about everything in his entire life, But he got up in front of his congregation and apologized for being caught. Now, he didn't apologize for what he did. He apologized for being caught. Now, the reason I bring this up is that, believe it or not, about a month or two later, about 100 to 200 people in that church actually tried to bring him back as their pastor. And when they couldn't do it, they split off and formed a new church and made him pastor. And within about 4 months, that church split up because he turned around and did the same exact thing to them, and he was caught in more lies and new lies. The point being is, he was the leaven in the lump that should have been discarded. He wasn't. And because of that, it kept growing in the church over and over and over again. One of the things also, if we look here at verse 8, that should be explained, it says, "For Christ," in 7, "For Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." We need to have a little bit of understanding about what the leaven was and the Passover was here, okay? When Passover came each year, which, remember, that was based on when the children of Israel were ready to leave Egypt, they put blood of the lamb on top of their door frames. The angel of the death passed over and did not kill their children, etc. One of the things that had to happen to prepare for it every year, and still happens in Orthodox Jewish houses, okay, is that the woman of the house has to go through that house and eliminate every trace of leaven. They even have special little tools and special brushes and special pans. I remember a couple years ago when the guy was here from the Jews for Jesus, I forget his name now, he explained that and went into detail, and it was fascinating to listen to the fact this entire production, and then the husband comes in and proclaims it leaven-free and all this stuff. This was a big deal. This wasn't just a little thing or something like that. So when Paul's talking about getting the leaven out of the church, the Jews in the Corinthian church would know exactly what he was talking about. He's talking about the fact that you can't allow little things to build up and fester. Okay? Now, let's look at the prohibition here. If you look in verse 9, before I read that, one of the questions we have is, so does this mean that we can no longer associate with people who are grotesque sinners? After all, I've got people that I know who do things that I sure wouldn't do. You probably do too. Is it actually talking about that and saying avoid them? What we're going to learn is the answer is no. And the reason I say that is because Paul differentiates between grotesque sin within the church and grotesque sin outside of the church. They're two different things. In verse 9, he says, "I wrote to you in my letter," and evidently there was a previous letter to the Corinthians that's been lost. "I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with immoral people." Well, that sounds like you can't associate with anybody who's a sinner, right? And actually, that's again pornea. That's again pornea. So basically, anyone who's sexually immoral, you can't associate with it. But he goes on. He says, "I did not at all mean with the immoral people of the world, or with the covetous and swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you would have to go out of the world." So it's pretty clear here. What Paul's saying is, I'm not talking about people in the world. I can tell you this. One guy that I've associated with for many years, sometimes we'll go a year or two without talking, and then he'll phone me back up. He's been a personal friend and a guy who I've worked with on many occasions. Okay? Open homosexual. And not only that, but promotes homosexuality. I can still be his friend, and there is no biblical prohibition against that. The reason is simple. Because he is not inside the church. He's never claimed to be a believer. And after all, if you think about it, I mean, what are we supposed to do? Go to everybody and say, okay, clean up your life, then we'll witness and tell you about Jesus, then you can come join us. Oh, that would go over real big. And that's not what Paul said. That's not what Christ said either. If you look at what Christ did, Christ sat down with the tax collectors and the prostitutes and ate with them. Now, one big quick thing here, and this applies to my friend also. One thing that's important here, Christ did not go to a strip club for a dinner with the prostitutes and try to witness to them there. He didn't participate in their sin, but he also didn't shut them off as people. So what we have here is Christ, what did he do? He had dinner with them. He talked with them. He would communicate with them. That's the way we should be responding to people around us in the world. But we shouldn't be participating in their sin. You'll never find an instance where Christ participated in the sin of the people he was witnessing to. But he deliberately went to the people that were the lowest rungs of society, who had committed porneia, who were the sexually immoral of that time. He had no problem associating with them because he cared about the people. But they were not people who were part of the church. Now, if we continue on in these verses, what we're going to see is, Paul said, "But actually I wrote to you not to see any so-called brother if he should be an immoral person or covetous or idolater or reviler or a drunkard or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one." A couple of things we want to look at here. Number one, specifically he's saying about people within the church, and he uses the term so-called believer. Now that raises a couple of questions. One of which I would put to you is that it is not necessarily even talking about true believers, but instead Paul is saying if a person is in the church and calls themselves a believer. It's not our job to judge whether someone is a true believer or not. But if a person is in our church and coming to our church and calling themselves a believer and sleeping with their stepmother, and everybody knows about it on a regular basis, as a church we would have an obligation to do something about this. Okay? On the other hand, as I said, it doesn't mean they're necessarily believers. The other thing I want to point out here is that it says not to associate with any so-called brother. That word associate in the original language has a variety of meanings. It can mean intimate relationships with that person. It can mean to mingle with that person. It can mean to keep company with that person. So it's got a wide variety of meanings. And basically it's saying, don't be hanging out with this person. Don't be hanging out with this person within the church committing grotesque open sins. Okay? So there's the command there to the Corinthians. And we're going to apply it to our church in a minute and all churches in a minute here. In addition to that, Paul concludes with, "But those who are outside, God judges. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves." As far as the unbelievers go out there, let God judge them. Don't worry about that. On the other hand, within the church, problem. And one thing I should say here, anytime we talk about judgment, you're always going to have thrown up in your face, "Judge not lest ye be judged." Okay? From Matthew 7:1. The problem is most people don't have a clue as to what the context of that is talking about. Many times the church is called to judge and exercise judgment. This is one case, certainly within the church, we are called to exercise judgment. The plan. What can we actually learn from this? First thing we can learn is the fact that Paul is talking about an extreme circumstance. I think we would all agree if someone gets openly caught sleeping with their stepmother or their mother, that's pretty extreme on the grotesque sin scale. Okay? He's not talking about spitting on the sidewalk. The other thing he's not talking about is he's not talking about deputizing all of us as junior Holy Spirits so that we can plant microphones and ferret out all the sinners in the church. So first off, we have to realize it's a grotesque sin. Secondly, we have to realize it's not only a grotesque sin, but we really aren't given a lot of specifics here because, again, it is about the church, but Paul wasn't going through and saying, now he did say, drunkards, revilers, etc. We still don't have a lot of specifics, so my point here is I think each church needs to decide what is acceptable and not acceptable as far as grotesque sin goes. Now, first thing people are going to throw up is say, hey, wait a second, are you condoning sin? Or if the sin's secret, does that make it okay? Absolutely not. Remember, we're talking about reputation of the church here. And again, it is not our duty to ferret out every possible sin. In addition to that, it's not our duty to take someone for minor things and to say to them, now we need church judgment or church discipline on you or something like that. But the fact is, to ignore church discipline completely is to ignore the Word of God. It needs to be part of a church, but it needs to be carried out in grotesque situations. I'll give you another example, which I've heard of several times. I know of several churches that have refused to allow abortion doctors to take communion or to be members in their church. I can understand that. I think it's probably a good rule to have something like that. That if that's your business and you're killing infants, yeah, you really shouldn't be a part of our church. But my point is, it's up to each individual church to decide what's right and wrong in this case, and decide what the standards are. Not that there's not right and wrong, but what the standards are for when church discipline is going to be made. In addition to that, we've got to remember again, this does not apply to unbelievers. It does not mean we go around saying, boy, we're so spiritual, we caught you. It's not what it's talking about. It's within the church only. We can also see that there are stricter standards for believers than there are for non-believers. Once a person calls themselves a believer, we have a duty and obligation to act as we are. A lot of times we miss that. A lot of times we think, oh yeah, I got fire insurance, no problem, I'm going to heaven. That's not the end of it. The Christian life is the entire Christian life. And again, what I would say we can take from this is, as believers, we have higher standards. We're not to be telling unbelievers that we won't associate with them because of sin. And some type of church discipline is valid within the church, but I'll leave that to the church to decide what's valid and not valid. Next week we're going to continue. We're going to step into 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and what we're going to find out next week is there was a situation going on where there was a lot of stuff going on between, is it actual sin or is it tradition? And we run into that a lot in our churches nowadays. So we're going to continue 2 more weeks within the Corinthian church, within the book of 1 Corinthians. We'll see what Paul had to say to them, and hopefully we can learn from it and apply it to ourselves as well. Let's go ahead and pray.